her to you. So our next speaker is Prof. Deborah Schwengel. Prof. Schwengel is an associate professor of anesthesiology and critical care medicine. She's the director of anesthesiology and critical care medicine training and the residency program at Johns Hopkins. And she's also on the faculty of the MEHP program at Johns Hopkins. She's certainly one of my mentors. She knows everything about everything. And like Prof. Angaretti, she's an amazingly generous person. So please join me in welcoming Prof. Deborah Schwengel.
Hi there. I feel very inflated. Thank you, Mark, for setting me up for the greatest reputation, and let's see if I can live up to that. It's really a pleasure to meet all of you in this forum. Someday I hope to be down there to do something like this in person. But certainly Zoom has transformed our world, and we are able to hold these international teaching courses and other kinds of ways of gathering, and it's just fascinating, and it's a great opportunity. And so thank you for inviting me, Mark. And I get to give you two talks tonight, it's tonight for me, this morning for you. And my first one is about PowerPoint. Before I share my screen and open this up, I want to know from you, is this a dominant form of teaching that you use? How much do people use PowerPoint in your world?
All the time.
So I see a lot of nods. And so what has happened here is, we tend to think that PowerPoint is the greatest way to put people to sleep. And so death by PowerPoint is kind of a common phrase. And my goal is to try to teach you how to use PowerPoint in a way that doesn't kill your audience. Any thoughts about that? Do you guys see PowerPoint as a death sentence? I see a lot of nods. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. So I call this PowerPoint Pearls and Pitfalls because it can be a blessing and it can be a curse. We want to make it a blessing. So my learning objectives for this talk are, by the end of this session, you will be able to discuss, first of all, when or when not to use PowerPoint, and then describe how to engage an audience using PowerPoint, and then demonstrate how to design PowerPoint slides. So when to use PowerPoint? Well, it is a very convenient tool to use when you are addressing a large audience in a large room, and you need to get everybody on the same page. And obviously, it's not as easy to have a conversation. It is also very useful for teaching knowledge, because you can display content in a variety of ways to make it possible for your audience to understand what your goals are and what your content is. It's very helpful if you have data to show, if you have visuals to show, and these things support your message and allow you to develop a story. So ideally, you would have this story to tell to your audience to bring them into the fold and get them engaged in the message that you have. So story progression is very effective. And so if you can weave something throughout the talk that keeps people coming back to that kind of central core message, you can keep them alive. You can keep your audience awake. And so a time that you might not want to use PowerPoint is when you would like to facilitate discussion, and especially if it's a large group, a large audience. And also if you want the learners to use some hands-on activities or for simulation, that just doesn't work with PowerPoint so well, although you can use PowerPoint to enhance some content that you would like to discuss or to reflect on a simulation using some content in PowerPoint. PowerPoint is not very helpful for cognitive problem solving. That's best done in small groups where you get your learners to maybe look at a few slides, set the scene for your people to then problem solve. And the other thing is for demonstration purposes, you would probably choose something other than PowerPoint. And so I wonder if at this point we should stop and discuss just a little bit about your experiences in using PowerPoint in ways that are a little bit different than the large classroom, just mega presentation to like a national audience or something like that. Do you guys have any examples you would like to share?
I mean, we often use a kind of a blended teaching approach where we have a kind of initially a PowerPoint presentation of some theoretical knowledge, and then followed by a group discussion, followed by a number of simulation sessions. So kind of using PowerPoint presentation for kind of theoretical data transfer and using that to kind of generate discussion as a lead-in for simulation-based training.
I think that's a great way to use it as this blended kind of approach. And so I'm going to talk a little bit more about that coming up. And does anybody else want to talk about that kind of approach or times that you've had great success using PowerPoint in a blended approach?
So over the last 10 years, we've run this course where we take all the new doctors that come in and we train them in exactly what they need to be able to do just to be able to work in the department, called ED Essentials. And in the first few courses we ran, it was quite PowerPoint heavy. But with each feedback session that we got from the doctors, we made the PowerPoint section smaller and smaller. And so it's 10 to 15 minutes of PowerPoint followed up by 30 minutes of sim. And so there's a 2-day course. We just repeatedly run a little bit of theory and then get them to do things. And over the course of the 10 years, we've actually had the last few years, we really haven't modified it a lot, because that combination of using PowerPoint a little bit and then bringing in the simulation or hands-on activities combination seemed to work really well and got good feedback.
I would agree. I think that is a great way, and you can punctuate certain time points in your teaching to bring people back, to help them to focus on something new, to wake them up a little bit, to do a variety of those things that you're talking about that really help to reinforce the concepts and help them get a little bit of baseline knowledge to move forward with whatever you're teaching. So I think that's a great approach. Any other reflections from others? Okay, so it just so happens my next slide is about the blended approach. So I like to use, when I run a workshop, I like to use a little bit of PowerPoint just in a mini didactic kind of format. And this is then sets the stage for the working groups in a workshop to sit at their tables and create together, hopefully as a community thinking kind of exercise that can work really, really well. I want to also, though, suggest that there are ways for you to use the large group format with PowerPoint, but have them break up into some little engagement groups as well. So there's a technique called think, pair, share. I don't know if any of you have ever experienced that. Do you know what that is? So I see a few nods. Basically, you can give your large classroom talk, and you can stop at a certain point and use some kind of stimulus to what either visual or auditory, get them to consider a scene or consider a problem, break up into pairs and think about that together in the large classroom, and then either have them come back and share if anybody in the audience is willing to share, or just then re-engage with you as the speaker for this large group. And another thing could be reflecting. They could write a little thing like a 1-minute paper, or they could reflect aloud if they want to share what they have to think about what you have suggested. There's another opportunity, and that could be role playing. So even in a large group, sometimes you can have a pair of people come up and do some role playing. If I'm going to do that, I usually ask for people ahead of time to think about doing that, because if you put somebody on the spot, that doesn't work very well. It just makes them uncomfortable. So if you know the people you're going to be working with, and you have the opportunity to talk about the little scene that you want them to play, and they have a chance to think about it, then many times people are willing to do that. Another opportunity is to do a little demonstration. So sometimes get a few pieces of equipment together to show maybe like a little science fair experiment or something in the front of the classroom, if it's not too large of a classroom. And that way you can actually demonstrate for the group. So those things sometimes work. It just depends on your whole strategy, the size of the classroom that you're talking about, and the topic. So you want to really make your audience engage with you, get them to want to participate, and that sometimes involves the stories and things like that I talked about. And not reading from your PowerPoint slide, because as this person said, that's actually a form of conscious sedation. And I agree with that. How many times have I nodded off in the middle of a PowerPoint presentation in a large dark room? It's just not possible to pay attention for that long, especially with the lights off. And especially in anesthesiology, we do our talks at sometimes 7 o'clock in the morning, and there's not enough coffee to keep us all awake. So tell a story. So start off with even telling your own individual story. You can sometimes make fun of yourself. Sometimes you can tell maybe a poignant story about a touching experience that you have, or an important experience that you've had that is related to the topic that you want to teach about. And so this makes you a relatable individual. Nobody is going to engage as well with, I think, a Nobel laureate, unless you're in their sphere of science, and if you know what they're talking about. And it's pretty easy to lose your audience if you're talking about really hardcore basic science, and maybe not everybody in the room is a hardcore basic scientist. So if you can, though, maybe relate a story about maybe how you discovered a certain thing and how it brought you to this idea of inventing this thing that allowed you to become a Nobel laureate, well, maybe that's a little bit more compelling. But once you start putting up all of the the chemical structures and maybe the physics equations and things like that, it's pretty easy to lose members of your audience unless they're a very, very specific audience. And so one of the things I like to do is, if I don't have a story I want to tell about myself, is maybe give a case scenario. And typically, if it's based on a real case, you can bring people in medicine because everybody can engage with this kind of thinking. And so one of the cases that I like to teach on, because I teach a lot on pediatric obstructive sleep apnea, is this case of 37-month-old twin boys who presented for a tonsillectomy for obstructive sleep apnea. And then I get my students usually to think about, well, how would you evaluate their readiness for anesthesia? How would you prepare to do the case? What kind of information would you want to have before you dig into this? And what must you know about, what do you need to know about where the child goes afterwards? Is it safe to send these children home? Sorry, one of my family members is trying to call me. And so you need to have a lot of information, and then when I tell you that the outcome of the story, you have a lot of attention with your audience, and so this is a great way to engage even in a large classroom. And then you could show a story, or a picture. So here's a great picture that I like to show to get people to think about, well, oh my God, this kid's sticking a steak knife into an electrical socket. Did he die? What happened? Where are his parents? What is going on here? And if this is my child, what would I do to discipline this child? And is this a teachable moment, or are you so frightened that you're just going to lose it? And so a picture like this can evoke emotion in your class, and you can get people to really engage with you, especially if this is related to your topic. Although sometimes I might throw in something that's kind of off the wall in the middle of a talk, even a serious talk, to wake everybody up. So why not, so I'm going to talk about obstructive sleep apnea, but why not throw this picture in the middle where everybody's getting a little bit glazed over, and get them to think about this, and then there's laughter in the room, and you get a different kind of engagement, and so you can use a tool like this to really wake everybody up. So when you are trying to motivate your crowd, you really need to focus on a central idea and keep it very relevant to the audience. You want to help the learners feel that their learning goals are being met. Because if they're not, you're going to lose them. Again, this is the idea of, if you have a hardcore basic scientist teaching a bunch of residents, people who are training in their clinical worlds, you're probably going to lose their attention. But if you have a clinical topic, like my topic of the twins with obstructive sleep apnea, then you are going to meet their goals, and you're going to have their attention, because they need to know how to manage that case, and they are going to have to talk through that, and at some point to take their oral board exams and maybe defend their treatment of a patient like that. So you want to make it relevant and help them feel successful, and make sure that you're providing enough explanations so that they're satisfied with the encounter, and that enhances motivation for their attention to your talk. So when you are designing your talk, you want to start with creating learning objectives tell them what you want them to learn. So here's an example. By the end of the presentation, you will be able to list or describe or formulate or name or demonstrate something. And that way you will have them understand what you want them to get out of this. And so it also, helps you with your design of your talk. So now just a little bit of a summary of how to teach effectively with PowerPoint. Just know and engage with your audience and set the stage with your learning objectives. Use blended techniques and create intrigue for your class. Would anybody like to reflect on any of these concepts before we go on to talk about designing PowerPoint? It sounds like some of you have used PowerPoint in very effective ways already.
I used to use a presentation for teaching called spot diagnosis quite a few years ago. So I would have a set of PowerPoint slides with, the ECG, rash, some sort of a fracture, X-ray, etc. And my first slide had what I would say is I want the spot diagnosis, initial management, dispositions. So I would go around the room and get it. So everyone knew that they were going to have to answer one of them. So it used to work well because it would create a discussion point and I could talk about things that really are high risk and had to be identified.
Yeah, I think that's a great example too.
I find the biggest challenge is actually knowing who your audience is and their spectrum of understanding. So, for example, in the talk that you've given so far, that little child sticking the knife into literally the PowerPoint was me. That's something I've done, but I've made sure my kids don't do it. But the difference, we have one of the doctors in our department. He's an amazing presenter and he has a huge, the narrative component is amazing, but then you walk out and you haven't actually learned anything, but you've been entertained and you feel like you know everything, which is sort of one end of the spectrum, and that appeals to everyone who's in the audience, especially when you're giving a combined nursing medical lecture. It works really, really well. But sometimes you really need to deliver content, and in the end, content, unless it's just boring. There's not finding the narrative, knowing where your audience is up to. That's really hard. That for me, it's figuring out who the audience is and what they know and where they're up to. And the closer they are together, the more tailored you can make it. But the more they're divergent, the delivering the content just heads towards the narrative and the entertainment component rather than the factual component. For me, that's the challenge.
I think, sorry, just from Mana's point, I think it also comes back to the learning objectives. When you actually talk about you left that room and you didn't really gain much, and it's out. Have we actually outlined our learning objectives well in the beginning and actually stuck to them? And that's so. If you kind of sort of follow that, then it's kind of hard to really digress. But I agree that happens. I just had a sort of question and sort of a strategy to look for creating that intrigue, and that's my biggest thing, to have that constant that in the learner creation of intrigue and maintaining that, because that's the only way to have that engagement. Otherwise there will be that bit of curtain coming in between every now and then.
I absolutely agree. So I think creating intrigue takes a lot of practice. And if you are an attentive kind of speaker, you can learn to do that somewhat over time. But I also agree that knowing your audience is really key. And what are we really trying to get out of this session too? So much of our our educational presentations are very serious. You know, we're trying to get our residents or our medical students to learn core content so they can take better care of patients. And so we have to get them to be believing that this is good for them. So relevance is part of that. The other thing is that I think works very well is to interject practice questions. If you're doing content that you can then stop for a while and give them a few practice questions and discuss the answers and why a particular answer is correct, and then you can review that. So that usually works pretty well to keep them engaged. So now let's just talk about some design principles. You want to make your PowerPoint presentations powerful, and there are some tricks. I think you don't want them to be too fancy and too cluttered. Simplify your content and your objectives, and try to demonstrate relationships so that people can follow the slides as well as what you have to say. You can use videos and visuals and things to improve processing as long as they don't dominate and don't take up too much time, and reduce a lot of the fluff that people put in there that's just too much unnecessary detail sometimes. And be very careful with color. As you can see here in this screen, you really can barely read the Mary Had a Little Lamb on the red background with the blue letters, but contrast is usually pretty easy to read. Yellow on blue is very good. And it's okay to do light on dark with appropriate contrast. Many people prefer dark on light, like black on white. And really avoid using a lot of distracting graphics like this. You really can barely read what's written here. So background is very important. And when we're talking about font, you want to use very simple fonts. So things like Arial and Calibri are very easy to use and very easy to read fonts. They are different from the serifs. So if you look down here, the serifs have these little feet on the all of your letters, and they tend to make your image more difficult to read. And so go with these simple fonts that don't have all the little feet. And there are a lot of plain fonts, and there are also a lot of serifs out there. Avoid all caps because that is fatiguing and more difficult to read. Italics are harder to read. Use bold only for the things that you want to highlight. And don't use underlining as a general rule because it hides your downgoing letters and is more difficult to read. When we're talking about size of font, if we're going to be presenting in a large classroom, it's a little different than when we're on Zoom. 24 is generally a little too small or the smallest you ever want to go. Most people say 28 is the smallest acceptable. 32 is better, and 36 is maybe better yet, or especially for headers. So if you need a smaller font, use fewer words or more slides. Don't clutter up your slide. Don't try to cram too much into one slide. Take a look at your spacing. Don't space things together too tightly. Make it comfortable to the eye, and your audience will have a better understanding what you're trying to say and more ability to follow what you're presenting. Also, take a look at the space on the slide. Make sure that you merge your pictures with your words so that these connections can be made mentally, and it's much more pleasing visually. So here's an example of how you kind of merge everything into a more pleasing way of presenting it. So now figures and graphs. Well, how many times have we been in a talk where the speaker says, I know you can't read this at the back of the room, And then you're just asking yourself, well, why then are you showing it? Because it doesn't make any sense to be apologizing about what you're demonstrating. So it is okay, though, to use the initial image and then to zoom in on one component of it. So if you're trying to show how much incredible work you've done and you have all of this data, okay, show it briefly and then just give the content that you really want them to pay attention to. The same is true for this kind of an image, and even like this kind of an image. But you can zoom in on what you want to have them pay attention to. And there are nice ways to do this with PowerPoint these days, where you can make everything flow from scene to scene and for content. And then you can go back to the whole image so that then you have demonstrated these relationships and your audience should understand what you have just taught them. So, but simplify as much as you can. If a simpler diagram is easier to follow, then use the simpler diagram. And make your layout logical. Use columns, use arrows, clear section headers, and so it's very easy for everybody to follow what you want them to see. Use eye-catching, intriguing, pleasing images. So I just happened to have this Melbourne Food and Wine Festival image that I found, and I just love it. I mean, who doesn't think that this is intriguing? I think it's a beautiful poster, as is the grassy plain seat on this piano, and maybe this is a pastoral kind of concert that is going to be presented, and it really demonstrates a concept that you want them to come away with. Enhance your impact with a combination of audio and visual. Combine them in a way that's not too cluttered. And you can use videos as well. They can be a great teaching tool, but you should always rehearse them at the venue in which you're going to present, because the video itself, the MP4 or whatever you're going to use, needs to be embedded into your PowerPoint. Don't try to link to YouTube or something like that, because sometimes you can't connect. And then it's just a messy way to try to incorporate a video into your talk. Also, don't use a very long segment. Use the shortest segment needed, and then you can create impact in your talk. So videos can enhance impact. But be careful what you link them with. So if you have something like this, you're looking at this the whole time and you're wondering, when is she going to fall over? Because here's this kid who's doing this incredible thing, bouncing on a pogo stick with two basketballs and maybe trying to put them through that hoop. And so that is going to occupy your viewers. So can you imagine if you were trying to teach about momentum or something like that, and here you want them to pay attention to this equation, and they're just going to be watching her the whole time. They're not going to hear a thing that you have to say. And so that's a problem with cognitive load. So you need to minimize sensory inputs so that your audience can pay attention to the content. So it would be okay to show this as an example of momentum or something like that after you teach the physics part or the math part. Animation is something that people like to use, and it should be used carefully, somewhat sparingly perhaps, because you sometimes can make your audience maybe a little dizzy. Have any of you used Prezi? So Prezi is a different software package that makes presentations. And Prezi, in my opinion, does a lot too much of this animation kind of stuff and spinning images. And I sometimes feel a little motion sickness when I watch a Prezi presentation. So, when you start doing this and you start doing this, it can be distracting, and it makes people not focus on your content as much. So use it sparingly. I think it is useful if you are going to reveal sequential points, so it can be used well for that. And it can be used if you're going to pose a question and then you reveal the answers later. Be careful if you're trying to show a picture from a PDF. They do not enlarge well. So whatever image that you want to use, you should make sure that you have a very high resolution image before you try to show it, and especially enlarged. So make your pictures as large as possible, high definition, and frame a portion of it if you need to define it well. So now just a summary of our discussion about design. Maximize contrast, maximize size of text, minimize number of words. Don't use sentences, make everything a bullet point, and only 5 to 6 bullets per slide. I would say even 4 per slide is better. And create visual balance on your slide. Use your graphs carefully. Use your photos or videos to illustrate certain messages, but don't dominate the talk with them. And practice in your venue to make sure that your video is going to work, and certainly preview in a large room. So I want to stop there. I'm sure I'm getting close to the end of my time, and want to give you a chance to ask questions or share anything that you would like to share.
Deborah?
Yeah.
I have a question about these design templates in PowerPoint. We all use it, but I don't know whether there's any scientific basis behind them, or it's just for the aesthetic appeal. Is there any way you choose a template which matches your audience, or which matches your type of presentation, or it just because I find most of the time they're not very helpful, they're not very good. What's your idea about that?
I think that's a great thought. I do not know about the science of PowerPoint design. Maybe some of you out there do know something about that. There's probably something that's been published and studied on that, but I do think that probably Microsoft is trying to stay competitive with some of the other software packages out there that have visual appeal. I do think that the design option can be nice. I used it for this slide set, and it can key in on certain phrases. So let's say your header of your slide is something about time. It may pull in a picture of a clock, and so that sometimes can be a helpful visual. But I think only you can decide if what it designs for you is going to be effective for your purposes. And so sometimes, yes, it can clutter too much. I do know that it doesn't work well if you want to have too many images on the slide. And so then the design feature will just not function. So I think it's up to us to think about how we want our slides to look, and of course we want them to be professional looking, but you also don't want them to be too boring, and you also don't want them to be too complicated and cluttered.
Deb, I reckon the biggest question that I get is, well, I don't want to remember everything on my 1 hour long presentation, therefore I'm just going to put all the text on the slide so I don't have to remember the whole presentation. Do you have any advice for people who with that problem?
So I think then you should be rehearsing your content and practicing your knowledge base before you give that talk. Because really, who wants to listen to somebody who's going to read from their slide? That's just that's boring. And so I think that you have to feel comfortable enough with your topic to be up there teaching it or presenting it. And so the slide notes option can work, but again, there's the danger that you can just read your notes, and that becomes very robot-like and not very engaging. So it's so nice when you can give a talk and you can actually see members of the audience. Like I can see some of you now. It helps because you can every now and then see a smile or a thumbs up or something like that. Similarly, in a classroom, you can see if people are engaged, and if they're not, well, then stop and do something to wake people up. Sometimes with residents, I'll stop and say, well, get up and do 5 jumping jacks because I can tell you're all tired and falling asleep. Or I'll dismiss them for 5 minutes to get coffee or something, because there's no point in talking to a sleeping group.
I'm just curious to know, because in the last 2+ years, we've kind of switched over to a lot of virtual stuff. And you just mentioned about, okay, it's good to sort of see each other. But it's sometimes very challenging in a Zoom kind of or any kind of virtual presentation, because half of them might be off video and you're not sure how engaged they are and all that. So the face-to-face versus Zoom is, I think, obviously face-to-face is kind of the gold standard, but I think this is another challenge to overcome.
Absolutely agree. And so when I'm teaching my residents or students, I just mandate that they put their cameras on. If I don't know the audience very well, I might not issue that mandate, but I do ask them. And I didn't have to ask any of you. You guys are just there. So it's great. Thank you for that.
Mark made us do it.
Mark made you do it?
I didn't make you do anything. You all have free choice.
No, I have to say you've all been a delightful audience, and I appreciate your engagement.
Okay, I think I'm just conscious of time, so I'd like to thank Deb so much for taking the time to teach us about PowerPoint presentations. Also, she'll be joining us later in the evening for her and morning for us.